Alder Wells, Arizona Territory, 1889, June. The kind of drought that does not arrive, it accumulates, one dry morning stacked on the last, until a valley forgets what a cloud was for. The town sat in the bottom of a long brown basin, and above it, on the shoulder of the mesa, a single green field burned bright as a lie against all that dust, because the company that owned the water watered its own ground first, and the town watered nothing, and everyone had learned to look at the green field the way you look at a thing you are not allowed to want. There was a spring up in the canyon called the Seven Sisters, and it had run for 400 years, and the town was named Alder Wells after wells that no longer held water, which is the kind of joke a place makes about itself when it has stopped being able to laugh. On the boardwalk outside the mercantile, a stranger stood with a tin cup of water he had not drunk, watching a woman carry 2 buckets up from the river that was no longer a river. He had ridden in the night before on a black horse. He wore a brown felt hat pulled low, a patterned wool poncho gone soft and pale with dust, a blue neckerchief, and a gun belt with 1 Colt in it. And in that Colt there were 5 cartridges and 1 empty chamber, because he rested the hammer on nothing, the way careful men did, so a fall or a kick could not fire the gun into his own leg. It was an old habit, and it had nothing to do with what happened here. What happened here happened because water runs downhill, and the only thing that has ever run it uphill is money. The desert never killed anyone in Alder Wells. A man who owned the water did that, and he did it with a padlock and a pencil and a green field, and never once fired a gun. 3 weeks before, in a town far to the north, the stranger had read a notice tacked to a land office wall, printed small, the way the important things always are. It announced that the Calder Land and Water Company had perfected its appropriation of the Seven Sisters flow, and that all deliveries below the head gate would henceforth be measured and rationed by the company's own gauge in a season the company alone would declare to be one of scarcity. He read it once for the words, and once for the trick hidden in them, which was the phrase the company's own gauge. Then he folded the notice into his saddlebag and turned the black horse south, because he had learned a long time ago that when a man gets to both own a river and measure it, the river always turns out to be smaller than it was. No man ever died of thirst in a country with a spring in it. Men die of whoever holds the key to the spring. There were 2 powers in Alder Wells, and they slept in the same bed. The company owned the canyon, the head gate, the ditch, the reservoir it called the upper tank, and the assay of every drop that left the mesa. The sheriff owned the road and the jail and the word trespass, and the canyon was company land, so the law and the water were the same law. The company needed the valley's farms to fail, because a farm that fails is a farm that sells cheap, and a farm sold cheap comes with its old water share attached, and a water share is the only thing in that country worth more than gold, because you can dig for gold and you cannot dig for June. So the company did not steal the farms. It simply declared a drought that the sky had only half agreed to, and cut the lower shares to a trickle, and waited, and bought the ground of every man who broke. On the 15th of each month a letter came in from a paneled office 2,000 miles east, and it never mentioned a farm or a widow or a dead orchard. It mentioned acre feet. It was signed by Augustus Thane, who had learned somewhere in his 40s that a man does not have to be cruel if he can arrange for the drought to do his cruelty for him and sign for it under an act of God. He is the man this story is finally about, and he never comes within 1,000 miles of it. And that is exactly the point. Royce Calder ran the company on the ground. 44. Gloves indoors even in June. He read the acre-feet reports before he read his own mail. And for 2 summers those reports had told him the Seven Sisters was failing, that the flow was down to 1/3, that the drought was real and the shortage was honest. He believed the paper because the paper was his. He had written twice to the east explaining that the spring could not carry both the company fields and the valley in a dry year, and the east had written back that other superintendents made their acreage bloom in worse country, and Royce Calder, who was not a monster, had gone on ruining a valley he genuinely believed the sky was ruining for him. Court Vane was 31, and he carried the water. 4 men dead, all of them shot on company land, which in that county meant shot lawfully. Vane wore the only key to the headgate padlock on a rawhide thong around his neck, and he had a habit of drawing it out and wiping it on his sleeve when he was thinking, the way another man might turn a coin, and men who watched him do it said it was worse than watching him touch the gun, because the gun only killed you and the key decided whether your corn did. Harlan Speck was 53, and he was the honest one, which is to say he was the most dangerous of all of them and did not know it. He had surveyed for the territory before the company hired him as water commissioner, and every measure day he stood at the weir box below the head gate and read the depth off a painted gauge stick and signed for the delivery, and he believed, the way a man believes in the multiplication table, that a number read off a stick in clear water could not lie. He had never once climbed above the head gate to see where the clear water came from. He believed the gauge was neutral. A gauge is only ever as neutral as the man who painted the marks on it, and Harlan Speck had never asked who held the brush. And there was Bishop Ivins, 58, the Zangaro, the ditch tender, born to a father who had dug the first alder ditch by hand before there was a company or a Calder or a gauge. Bishop Ivins walked the full length of that ditch every dawn with a shovel on his shoulder, and he knew to the inch what every farm's share was supposed to be, and he was the only man in the whole arrangement who went where the water actually went, which is why this story has an ending and not just a headstone. The valley was not a number either. There was a widow named Wren Amley, 26, who worked 40 acres of corn and beans that her husband had proved up and then died proving, and her deeded share was the 7th on the ditch, older than the company by 9 years, and for 2 summers the company's gauge had declared her 7th share to be worth almost nothing. Every dawn she carried 2 buckets up from the mud that had been the river and poured them onto ground that drank them like an insult, and every dawn the green company field on the mesa above her caught the first light and threw it back down at her, wet. There was an old man named Tuck Renner, 70, whose apricot orchard had died standing the summer before. 40 trees his own father had planted, and he had not left. He sat under the dead trees in their gray shade, because it was still shade, and he told anyone who came near that the trees would leaf again when the water came back, and everyone let him say it. There was a family of 6 that had already sold and gone, and their share had gone with them up the mesa into the green. On the second morning the stranger walked out the ore road, which here was the ditch road, and stood at the wire fence where the company land began, and looked up the canyon at the head gate, a squat thing of mortared stone and iron with a padlock the size of a fist, and below it the dry ditch running away downhill toward the town, cracked and pale as an old bone. Bishop Ivins was there with his shovel, and the 2 men looked at the empty ditch together for a while. "How much is coming down?" the stranger asked. 7 inches by the gauge, the old Zangaro said. "Enough for the whole valley if the whole valley were a window box." He spat into the dust. "Spring's failing," they say. "You've walked it. 30 years. Then you know whether it's failing." Bishop Ivins looked at him a long moment, the way you look at a stranger who has just handed you the only true sentence you have heard in 2 summers. "The 7 sisters," he said slowly, "came out of that rock the same in the drought of 1871 as it does today. I have laid my hand in it every June of my life. It has never fallen. Not once. Not by an inch. Then where is it going?" "That," said Bishop Ivins, "is company land, and I am a company man, and I have a family, and I would like to keep walking my ditch until I die." He shouldered his shovel. But he did not walk away, and both of them knew what that meant. That evening the stranger went to the widow Amley's field and found her pouring the day's 2nd bucket onto the dust, and he stood at the edge of the dead corn and told her the thing nobody in Alder Wells would say out loud. "The spring hasn't fallen," he said. "You're being starved on purpose, so you'll sell your 7th share. And when you sell it, the water that was always here will go up the hill to that green field, legally, forever." Wren Emily set down her empty bucket and looked at him. And she did not cry, because she had done her crying the first summer and had none left for the second. "I know," she said. "Everyone knows. Knowing isn't a river." "No," he agreed. "But it's a start on one. Now, before the rest of this happens, you should understand that the swindle was real even if the rider is not. In the American Westwater was not a thing you found, it was a thing you claimed, under a doctrine the courts called prior appropriation, 4 words that ran everything west of the 100th meridian, first in time, first in right. The man who first put a stream to use owned that use forever, ahead of every man who came after, and he could sell it, lease it, or carry it 40 miles from the stream it was born in. And that meant water could be owned by a man who never farmed a day, gathered up share by share the way another man gathers mortgages, until a single company held the only wet thing in 100 dry miles and could turn a valley to dust by turning a wheel. The law even helped. Under the Desert Land Act, a man could claim 640 acres of desert for almost nothing if he swore to irrigate it, and companies filed those claims by the fistful, using hired men as fronts, and perfected water rights they had no intention of ever sharing. None of this was hidden. It was filed in open court, printed in the territorial statutes, measured by commissioners who signed their names in daylight. The theft of a river was not a crime in the West. It was a form. It was audited by the same men who profited from it, which is to say it was audited by no one, and that was not a flaw in the system. That was the system. On the 8th day, the stranger did a thing that made no sense to anyone watching. He walked up the ditch road to the wire and let Court Vane arrest him for trespass on company land. And he did it slowly, in daylight, in front of the town, standing on the wrong side of a fence, with empty pockets and a good gun belt, which was the one thing a man in that valley never did unless he wanted the key holder to come down and look at him. Vane came down. He took the Colt out of the stranger's holster and turned it over in his hands, and his face went into the private stillness of a man handling something better than he owns. It was a beautiful gun, worn honest, the walnut gone the color of dark honey. Vane put it in his coat. Then he drew the key out on its thong, wiped it on his sleeve out of pure habit, and unlocked nothing. Because a man does not need a gate to arrest another man, he only needs to be the one who holds the key to everything else. "You'll sit in the jail till measure day," Vane said. "Judge comes through on the first Monday. He'll give you 30 days on the county ditch for trespass." He smiled. "You'll dig the very ditch you came to stand next to." "All right," the stranger said, and let it happen. And every man in Alder Wells watched him let it happen, and not one of them understood what he had just watched. Because the stranger had not come to Alder Wells to be fast. He had come because Measure Day was in 6 days, and on Measure Day Royce Calder himself came up from the office and stood at the weir box while Harlan Speck read the gauge and signed the lawful delivery, and once a season the district judge rode the circuit through and heard whatever complaints the valley was fool enough to bring. And for 1 hour on that one morning every man who mattered would be standing in the same place, at the head gate, in the light, next to the water. The machine turned on a single hinge, the same as every machine the stranger had ever broken. Nobody in Alder Wells had ever looked to see where the water went. They had only ever looked at the gauge that told them it was gone. On his second night in the stone jail, Bishop Ivins came, on the pretext of bringing the prisoner his ditch digger's tools, and stood at the barred window in the dark. "You wanted to know where it goes," the old Zanjero said. "I'll tell you, and then I'll go home to my family, and I will not have told you." Above the head gate, he said, where no farmer was ever allowed, and no commissioner had ever climbed, the company had built a second gate that no gauge measured, a buried flume of mortared plank that took the whole living body of the 7 sisters and ran it sideways into the upper tank every night, filling the reservoir, that watered the green field, and released back into the valley ditch by day only the 7 honest inches that Harlan Speck would kneel down and measure in clear cold water and swear to. The spring was not failing. The spring was being drunk in the dark by a field, and measured at dawn by an honest man who had never climbed the 40 feet that would have shown him the flume. "Why, tell me," the stranger said. "Because I dug the first ditch with my father's shovel," Bishop Ivan said, "and I have spent 30 years being the man who carries a river to a valley, and this June I carried it to a padlock. A man wants to have been one thing before he dies. I would like to have been a Zanjiro and not a key." He set the shovel against the wall. "There's a barrel in my ditch shed," he said. "Madder root. Red dye. We use it to trace a leak, to see where the water sneaks off. A handful turns a ditch red for a mile, and stains nothing, and poisons no one." He was quiet a moment. "The flume runs at night. The tank is above the head gate. If a man were up the canyon before dawn on measure day, and the water were red when it came out of the rock, then every drop of it would tell on itself, in front of Speck and Calder and the judge and God, and no gauge on earth could measure a red river into being a small one." He picked up his empty tool sack. "But I am a company man with a family, and I have told you nothing, and I am going home." He went home. The stranger sat in the dark with a shovel and did the only arithmetic he had come to Alder Wells to do, which was not arithmetic at all this time, but color. Measure day came up white and already hot at 5:30, 109 degrees before the sun cleared the mesa, and the whole apparatus of Alder Wells gathered at the head gate the way it did once a season. Royce Calder came up in a buggy, gloves on, the acre-feet ledger in a leather case that told him the spring was dying. Harlan Speck knelt at the weir box with his painted stick ready to read 7 honest inches out of clear cold water and sign for them. The circuit judge sat his horse in the shade of the only cottonwood left alive. Court Vane stood behind a short line of chained trespass prisoners with the beautiful stolen colt now riding on his own hip, and he had worn it 8 days and never once opened the loading gate to see how the man he took it from had left the hammer. The widow Amley stood at the wire with old Tuck Renner and 40 other valley people who had come, as they came every measure day, to watch a man in clean gloves tell them the sky had done this, and the stranger stood in the chained line in the white light with his eyes front, because he had spent the black hours before dawn not in the jail but up the canyon, 40 feet above the head gate, at a buried gate no gauge had ever measured, emptying a barrel of madder root into the throat of the 7 sisters, and then walking back down and letting Court Vane chain him into the line before first light, so that no man there could say the prisoner had done anything at all but stand still. Harlan Speck bent to the weir box. He dipped the painted stick, and the water that came up around it was red. Not brown, not muddy, not the pale of dust. Red as a wound, red as a thing telling the truth for the first time in 2 summers. Red flowing thin and honest down the valley ditch where 7 inches had always run. Harlan Speck stared at his own stick as if it had bitten him. Then, because he was a surveyor before he was a coward, he did the thing no commissioner had done in the history of the company. He stood up, and he turned around, and he looked up the canyon, uphill, where he had never once looked, and he followed the red. And 40 feet above the head gate, gushing out of the mouth of a buried flume that no ledger admitted existed, running sideways into the upper tank in a fat red rope of water 4 times the size of anything the valley had ever been allowed, stood the whole living 7 sisters, dyed the color of the truth, pouring into a company reservoir at the exact hour the company swore the spring had failed. The tank was filling red. The Greenfields water was standing there in the light, red, 4 times 7 inches, in front of the judge and the widow and 40 witnesses, and a commissioner who could no longer unsee it. "Mr. Calder," said Harlan Speck, in the flat, sick voice of an honest man doing the worst arithmetic of his life in public, "how much water do we have?" And Royce Calder, who was not a monster and did not become one that morning, who had believed his own ledger for 2 summers because the ledger was his, looked up the canyon at the red river he had been drinking in the dark, and understood in one long second that the drought he had apologized to the East for had been running through a plank flume the whole time. And reached. Out of nothing but instinct, for the man who had turned the water red, which was the chained stranger in the line. He did not reach for a gun. Royce Calder had never held a gun. He pointed one gloved hand at the stranger and said, "Take him." And Court Vane drew the beautiful stolen Colt from 4 feet away, put it at the back of the stranger's head, and thumbed the hammer. Click, nothing, an empty chamber, where a careful man rests his hammer, the oldest, cheapest habit in the West, taken off him by a man who had never in his life bought his own gun and had therefore never learned how another man loads one. One heartbeat of nothing at all. The stranger was already turning. He had 18 inches of chain between his wrists, and he put it across Vane's gun arm and broke it in 2 places, and the Colt came loose in the hot air, and the man it belonged to took it out of the air with his ironed hands and did not point it at Court Vane, who was on his knees now with one arm hanging wrong, and did not point it at the judge or the sheriff, but pointed it, flat and level, up the canyon at the Red River no one could stop looking at. "You can shoot the man," the stranger said, and his voice carried across the headgate in the white heat, to Speck and to Calder and to the widow at the wire and to the judge in the shade. "You can't shoot the water. It's red for a mile. It'll be red at noon and red at dusk, and every honest man in this valley can walk up here and see for himself where a spring that never failed has been going every night for 2 summers. Kill me, and it stays red. That's the whole trick of it. I didn't beat your gun, I beat your gauge." Court Vane, on his knees, reached with his good hand for the second gun in his boot, because a man like Court Vane always has another man's gun. Bang! It was the only shot fired at the headgate that morning, and it went into the ground beside his hand, and Court Vane stopped reaching. The 2 company riders behind him looked at a chained man holding a smoking Colt and a Red River telling on their employer, and they arrived, both at once, at the correct conclusion, and raised their hands. The judge got down off his horse and walked up the canyon in his good boots to look at the flume with his own eyes, because he was a circuit judge and had been lied to by better-dressed men than these, and what he saw up there ended the Calderland and Water Company's drought in the length of one walk. The stranger crouched and picked Harlan Speck's painted gauge stick out of the red water and held it up. "This was never wrong, Mr. Speck," he said, not unkindly. "It measured exactly what they let past the gate. It just never once got to measure the whole river. That's how they use honest men. They don't ask you to lie, they only ask you not to climb." He handed the honest man his stick back, wet and red, like a thing returned. "Here is what the red water bought, because you should have all of it, and not only the part that feels good." Court Vane went to Yuma for the killings he had done on company land that the company had always called lawful, because with the company suddenly worth nothing to protect. 4 old graves became 4 murders overnight. A man is only ever as innocent as his employer is powerful. Royce Calder was tried in Prescott that winter, and he was not tried for starving a valley, because the territory had no crime for that, and not one dead apricot tree was named in the indictment. He was tried for filing a false measure of water with the territorial commissioner and defrauding the senior appropriators of the flow they lawfully owned, which is to say he was punished for the paperwork of the theft and not the theft, and he paid a fine the company could afford and served no day at all, because stealing water from poor men has never once, in the history of that country, been the kind of stealing that sends a man to prison. Harlan Speck resigned as commissioner the same week. He could not be an honest gauge for a company he now knew painted the marks, and he went back to surveying, and he sleeps well, and that may be the most frightening sentence in this story. Because the man who measures the water is always going to sleep well, it is the men below the gate who lie awake. Bishop Ivins is still the Zanjero. The county took the padlock off the headgate and hung the key in the courthouse, and for one whole season the 7 sisters ran down to the valley the way it had run for 400 years, and old Tuck Renner's dead orchard did not leaf again, because dead is dead. But the widow Amley's corn came up green in August on ground that finally got its 7th share. And she stood in the middle of it and did not cry. Because she was still out of crying, but it was a different kind of not crying than before. And the green field on the mesa went brown for one summer, which the whole valley walked up the hill to look at, the way you go look at a thing you were never allowed to want and now no one is allowed to have. But the water law stayed exactly as it was written. First in time, first in right. Nobody repealed a word of it, because it was never the law that was broken, it was only the flume. The company sold its Alder holdings that autumn to another company 2 valleys west, at a price that made a profit even after the fine, and the new company filed its water rights properly this time, in open court, in daylight, and took a different valley's river uphill to a different green field legally forever, and no stranger will ride into that one, because there will be nothing to break. It will all be a form. In a paneled office 2,000 miles east, in November, Augustus Thane read a clipping about a red river in Arizona Territory. He read it once, for the one useful thing in it. He did not care about a commissioner or a widow or a man on a black horse. He found the flaw the writer had found, and he wrote one line to his lawyers, and the line said that in all future appropriations the company's diversion works shall be filed of record and inspected by the commissioner before the season of scarcity is declared. He fixed it, not the theft. The flume. Next June, in some other valley, the whole river will go uphill to the green field in broad daylight with a stamped permit on it, and an honest commissioner will climb up and inspect the diversion and sign that it is all lawfully in order, and it will be. And the corn below the gate will die anyway, on paper, legally, measured, correct. That is what a man like that does with a writer like this one. He does not hunt him. He reads him, and corrects the one flaw the writer found, and makes the next theft, too, legal to die. The stranger rode out on a Thursday. The widow Amley walked the black horse up the ditch road and put the reins in his hand and tried to give back the little money he had left in her flour tin, and he closed her fingers on it and told her that a season of water costs more than she thinks it does, and to spend it like it might be the only one. She asked him where he was going. Nowhere, he said. That's the whole trick of it. Behind him a valley that had watched a green field drink its river every night for 2 summers went back to its corn, and far to the east a man in a cool office turned a page with a clean glove. The bounty on a man with no name and a black horse went up that month by $400, posted by nobody, payable in a town nobody could name. The Prescott paper ran 8 inches about a strange red flood in a company ditch, and never once printed the word stolen. He rode south toward whatever was waiting on the road ahead. He was not happy. Men like him do not get happy, they only get further down the road and a little more alone at every gate. Before you go, I need one thing from you. Comment below. 3 words. Where are you from? Country, city, the place you are listening from right now. I read every one, and I want to know who is out on this road with me tonight. This is the story of Alder Wells, a town named for water it no longer had, and a green field that drank a river in the dark, and a stranger who could not be shot fast enough to stop the color of the truth. What happens next? Where does he ride? Comment below and help me decide, because the road is long and the writer has not chosen his turning. Subscribe so you do not miss the day he finally turns east toward the paneled office and the clean glove and the man who owns the water everywhere. And one more thing. Comment and tell me which one you believe truly holds a man in this country. The desert, or the man who owns the water. Like this video if you believe the real enemy was never the drought and never the fastest hand, but the padlock and the gauge and the field that gets to be green while the valley dies. See you on the next road.